Explorer.
I'm your producer, Todd Bartu, and this is Offshore Explorer. Offshore Explorer looks at the world from the sailor's point of view, port by port. Together, we share stories that detail the important intersections between sailing culture and life, past, present, and future. Let me introduce our host, a lifelong sailor who has traveled the world, from mug yachts to tugboats to ice boats, and a published author who has written for both stage and screen, Captain Scott Dodgson.
Hey Todd, how are you doing? A little windy down here in the marina. Even though they are not giving us a small craft warning, it seems to be a little bit gusty. We've got that new front moving through, so it's still pretty good sailing out there.
That's great, and it seems like people are responding well to last week's episode, and I understand we have a bit of news. We have had a facelift. Our offshoreexplorer.org has had a facelift, and we've updated the website. It's still a work in progress, but you can go to offshoreexplorer.org and listen to past episodes, which is very exciting.
Yeah, we have. We've worked very hard. There's a lot of technical website stuff that professional guys have had to do. But we've actually, we slow rolled it out without telling anybody, and we've had a lot of views. And you'll find all the podcasts on the site, as well as our sponsor links and a bunch of other stuff. And we're building it up. We're going to move the store over there, Ship's Locker. And it's, these things, they take time. But we're very pleased with the way it looks, and we invite you to go ahead and explore.
Going off of that, make sure you go to offshoreshipslocker.com for all your sailing needs. We have in there special partners of products that we endorse, and it will help you to kit out your boat, whatever you need. And on that note, let's talk about what we have planned for today's episode.
Yeah, well, today I'm dipping into one of my more animated features, which is dinghies and dinghy motors. And I recount a couple of stories about dinghies. I have thousands of stories about dinghies. I have tons of stories about dinghies. The dinghy is sort of like the automobile for the boat owner. And you're always using it, and it's always going on, and I have a lot of advice and some very strong opinions, which I hope people will call me on and say, oh, no, and we can start a discussion on dinghies. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Take it away, Scott.
Let's talk about the second most expensive boat in your two-boat arsenal. Your dinghy, your annex, as they say in French, your tender. There's a lot of choices to be made, a lot of disparity between what is good quality and what is useful and what the price is around those things. Now, I've had a number of dinghies over my span of sailing, and if you are a person who's intending to or does stay on the hook a lot, then dinghies are really, really important to you. I mean, you have the collapsible dinghies, which, you have to put apart, and you put a little, 2, 3, 4, 5 horsepower engine on, and you putter in to the dock. You leave your little boat there and then putter out. This is the minimum you could have. If you get one of those small collapsible kind of canoe-like things and you think this is great because the storage of my boat, and I can put it in a corner and I don't have to think about it. I take it out and do. The reality is that it really sucks unless you're on a lake. I have helped numerous people caught in a strong wind, trying to get back to their boat in these little collapsible dinghies, and they are unable to. They can't row there. The wind is too much. They're saturated with water. They have a limited capacity at carrying stuff. And when you are a cruiser, and when you're out on the water and out on the hook all the time, your dinghy is your car. Your dinghy is everything. You use that as much as you use a car. Back and forth between the boat and the dock, going over to other friends' boats, taking the dinghy out to go to other anchorages where you may not be able to get your boat in to go, for example, for scuba diving. I used to have a really beautiful 15-foot Avon with a Yamaha 15 horsepower. Great engine. I'm going to get into the engines in just a second. But it was an inflatable, and it was great to get in and out of, to go diving with. It was stable. It could plane, get up, and scoot across any kind of choppy water that you would find normally in a bay. And, it could carry stuff. I could put cases of water and sodas and beer and groceries and stay relatively dry on my way out in conditions that were not quite as favorable. So getting into having that, because you have two things that are going on here in your choice of dinghy. The first is the cost. It's expensive to have a second dinghy, to have a dinghy that is a really good dinghy. And the other thing is storage. How am I going to store this thing on my boat when I go sailing? A lot of guys, I've towed my dinghy, literally towed it across the Caribbean for years. And towing requires a certain, you have to do it a certain way. The reason I like certain types of dinghies, for example, I like the Avon, I like the Caribe, and of course the primo dinghy of all time, the best one that's out there, is called the Novurania. I had a boat I ran that had a hard type dinghy, which was a Boston whaler type, and it had a Dodgson 30 horsepower, I believe, and this had a very low freeboard, and I mean, there's nothing like a Boston whaler to go scooting around a flat kind of lake-like experience or a flat bay kind of experience. But if you have to go to a beach, for example, where there's a little bit of surf, your Boston whaler is going to get swamped. I've had it happen to me. I've had it get swamped. I've had, the battery, water get all over the batteries, the whole thing fill up. I've had to pump it out, all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's also incredibly heavy. So if you're going to tow it behind your boat, it's a pain in the butt. Now, there is a reason, too, to have a Boston whaler, which is it's great for going out and fishing, for example. It's great to go water skiing behind if you have a powerful enough motor. So there's a lot of really good things with this. I mean, I have spent many an hour sitting in a Boston whaler, actually going lobster fishing, and it works out pretty good. It's better than a inflatable in that regard. But I go back to inflatables because inflatables are without a doubt my favorite. Okay, and the top of the thing is the Novurania. There is 15, 18-foot Novurania with like a 40 horsepower Yamaha. I've had three kinds of engines. Let me just address the engines, and this way we can all, if you have some questions about it or arguments or you want to make a point, just leave it in, just give us a message and I'll try to answer them in a second time. But my first off is my favorite is the Yamaha. Super reliable. I had a 15 horse Yamaha that I had for decades, and it was used every day. It got pounded. It got wet. It was underwater once. I abused the shit out of that thing, and it kept on running. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because I think it's appropriate. Some friends of mine were going from Madagascar down to Durban, South Africa. It's about 600 nautical miles. They were in a wooden power boat, about 50-some feet. They had this Yamaha 15 horsepower, which it was the captain's private motor, and he had his own dinghy that he had up on the foredeck, because this powerboat didn't have a dinghy or stuff. And like most people, when you have a large enough space, they'll keep the dinghy. The dinghy will be kind of like a life raft. That would be the purpose for it, as well as the day-to-day transportation. So they're going along from Madagascar in the middle of the night, cruising along, and they hit a log, and the log runs right through the hull of the boat. This is not uncommon in this part of the world, in Mozambique and stuff. When you have typhoons and big low pressure things, they rip trees and stuff and cause a lot of debris to be in the ocean. You have to be very careful about it. I have run into some of this stuff, and I mean, some of the logs are really huge, and if you hit them the wrong way, they'll stop your boat. They'll hole you. They'll put a hole in your boat. So this is what happened to my buddy. He put a hole in his boat, and the boat began to sink. And it was just, as he described it, he said, take the biggest tree you've ever seen and take one branch and run it all the way to the midship line. And I went, oh, that big. Yeah, it was like a 3-foot rip. So as the boat was sinking, and just as an aside for sinking boats don't sink very fast, okay? If you're on a big Lusitania ship liner, boats are going to sink relatively quickly, okay, because they're made of steel. But most boats are fiberglass, and in this case it was wood. They take a long time to sink. They go slow. So there is time for you to get your act together, get your escape bag, get your dinghy launched, get as much fuel in the dinghy as possible. Now, my buddy was thinking pretty smart at the time, so he put out his life raft. He called Mayday on his radio, and he was kind of in the middle of nowhere, basically, off the coast of Africa. It was about, I think he said about 240 nautical miles back to Mozambique, which is against the current and the wind, or go with the current and go with the wind to Durban, which was, roughly 260 nautical miles. A long way, to say the least. So he popped his life raft. It was a 4-man life raft with a cover on it. He put a 55-gallon drum of diesel fuel into the life raft. And he threw some pumps in there because they had diesel fuel on the boat because they didn't have enough diesel to make it all the way. And he got all the gasoline that he could find, and he put that in the dinghy. They put food in the Avon. It was an Avon, and he had a little 15-horse Yamaha, and he loaded it up with food. He had his radios, life vests, the whole shooting match. And then he and this 15-horse the boat sank eventually, and then he just started to tow the life raft with his dinghy. So what he did for this Yamaha 15 horsepower was he mixed diesel with gasoline. Now, how he got this to work, I have no idea, but he did get it to work, and it kind of created enough in the engine to keep the engine going and to allow the gasoline to be spread out. And eventually, in this combination, the diesel will ignite with the gasoline. It will foul the plugs, and he told me that he had to keep pulling the plugs out, cleaning them, putting them back in, but the whole Yamaha 15 horsepower kept on ticking. He and his mate eventually made it to Durban. Okay, came in, And the owner was at the yacht club, and he came down and says, "Hey, how you doing? Where's my yacht? Where's my boat?" And they had to explain to him, after being at sea, okay, for a week, that the boat sank, and that this is all they had left, was the life raft, an empty 55-gallon drum, and they were just, of course, exposed, and both of them ended up going to the hospital to recover. That 15 horse, he kept that because it kept running, and he threw some more gas in the boat, ran it. It was great. And he tells this story. I had met him in the Caribbean where he told me this story. He had this big old steel-hulled boat called Don Juan that he was going to be doing charters down in the Amazon. Very adventurous guy. And he had the boat in Fort Lauderdale or Miami, and he had the hull sandblasted and painted, and he had the dinghy motor on the back of the boat, and somebody had come by and stolen it, and which is like probably the worst thing you could have ever happen to that, because the thing was, I told him he should have called Yamaha and sent them the motor, just send them the motor and say, "Look, this is what I did to this motor, and here's my story." And they probably would have sent him some, nice 40 horsepower or whatever, and you would have been loving it. But he didn't, and he lost the motor. So I have a real affinity and love for the Yamaha motors. Now my first I had a 1 horsepower Johnson that I used to have on my boat, original boat, Steppenwolf. And, it was a little putter, and it worked pretty well. It was always flooded out and very difficult to start. And I had another Johnson 35, I think it was 35 horsepower boat that was on a Boston Whaler. That was a part of a package of a boat I was running. And I had a lot of problems with the floats in these motors, primarily because any kind of debris that was in the gas tank, you have to keep these gas tanks really clean. This is the difference between both the Yamaha and the Honda motors, is they're very forgiving. They're very precise engines, but they'll let a lot of shit go through. And, we oftentimes will have gasoline and fuel that will be in these tanks, the classic red tanks, and they'll be just filled up constantly, and sitting in the bottom of the dinghy, and that's it, and we kind of don't pay attention to it, but they end up getting some growth, they end up getting sand, all kinds of crazy shit ends up inside these tanks. And you have to really, keep your eye out on maintenance, but it's almost like the last thing you want to do in terms of maintenance. So the Johnson had these float switches, and they have these little jets, and the jets were always getting clogged with some sort of growth or debris. And I know all you experts out there will be going like, "Oh, well, you should put, this anti-growth stuff into it." It's like, that's great. Okay. But I'm talking about practical world. I'm talking about, filling up a 5-gallon or 10-gallon tank, every week, just like you do your car. I mean, how many people go and, check their gas tank on their car, or, you just assume things are clean. In the Baja, there's a famous Baja filter that you can filter gasoline through. Kind of not necessary anymore. It's nice to have, but not necessary, because in Mexico and in the Baja, their fuel handling has improved greatly from the late 70s and early 80s. And the fuel is very clean. But I always like the idea that, and that filter, by the way, is for diesel engines, not so much for gasoline engines. But in any case, it's, as you could tell, I'm madly in love with the Yamaha. But I've also had on a Novurania that was a part of a bigger ship that I was running, a bigger yacht. The Honda on the Novurania had a 50 horsepower Honda, and then I had another one that had a Honda in, which was 115 horsepower. And I love those motors. They are so quiet. And I mean, they're luxury. Don't get me wrong. They're not cheap. And if there's anything you could take from this diatribe I'm going through with about dinghies, is that if you spend the money on a dinghy, you're going to be really happy. If you try to get by on saying, well, I don't know, I can't get this up on my deck, or it's got to be really small. Look, you can buy. I had a Caribe. Now, if you don't know the history of this, the Italian guys that created Novurania, which is an awesome company and just brilliant dinghies, okay? Tenders, as the big boats would call them, but they have smaller ones that are really brilliant. They're tough, they're UV resistant, which is the key thing, and hard bottom, put a motor on them, they're efficient, you can keep them clean, they're wonderful things. The drawback is they're kind of heavy to a certain extent, but they are really useful. And when it's like a car. It's like, okay, are you going to do a Yugo for? That's what you're going to drive back and forth, 10 hours a day or whatever the case may be. And that car's going to fall apart on you. And that's what happens to these cheaper dinghies. You're going to end up using it a lot, and it's going to fall apart. And if you don't use it a lot and you leave it sit around, it's just going to dissolve under the sun and just wear and look terrible. And in a couple of years' time, you're going to be buying a new dinghy. So my advice is get the best dinghy you can afford. Find a way to make it fit. Remember, you probably end up towing it most of the time when you're sailing. Yes, it doesn't enhance your sailing performance, but if you're cruising, you can live with that. You really can live with that. So these Novurania, started by a couple of Italian guys, brilliant engineers. They sold the company and they moved to Venezuela, and they had a do not compete clause in their sales contract. But they started a new company in Venezuela where their do not compete clause didn't apply, sort of. So this is what they did. They started another company called Caribe. Same materials, same boat, same everything, half the price. I bought a Caribe after my Avon had sunk. And the story behind that it's actually twofold. I was in St. Thomas, and my poor Avon dinghy had been punctured so many times in the bow that every time I got in the boat, every morning, I'd have the foot pedal, and I'd have to pump that sucker up because the bow would just fall down. And I had patched it myself. I had taken all the patches off and sanded it and prepared it, cleaned it, put patches back on it. It would be inflated for like 3 days, and then it would die. I took the whole dinghy into a guy who does that kind of work professionally, even though I think I was doing it exactly the right way. And he did it. A week later, the bow of the boat was down. So it was just like on its last legs. And I was being, pushed around with a 15 horsepower Yamaha, which I love the motor. But when I was in getting the bow looked after, a guy said, "Hey, we have a sale on Yamahas." I said, "Really?" And he would take my 15 horsepower as a trade-in, and there was a big discount. And if you know anything about being in the Caribbean, everything costs a lot more because of the shipping. So it's always a little extra to get things there. I tell this story before about shipping. And so in any case, I pulled the trigger and I got a 40 horsepower, because one of the things that you'll find when you have a dinghy is you get a little competitive ego-wise. When you see these guys scooting around your anchorage And they got a brand new dinghy. They got a nice, powerful motor. They're whipping across at 30 miles an hour. And you're, puttering home after drinking all night and, with your wife and girlfriend or maybe both. And, both of them are sitting there getting wet, and, oh, yeah, it's a joyful time, but we're covered with water and we're a little drunk and blah, 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 rah, rah, rah. You get jealous. You say, man, I wish I had one of those really nice dinghies with a really powerful motor that we can just pop in, feel dry, boom, take off. Everybody will look at us and go, that's not a dinghy, that's a tender. That's not a dinghy, that's a tender. And it just makes you feel so much better. It's like having a nice car, right? We all love nice cars. We all love new cars, no matter what they are. We love a new car. Can't afford a new car sometimes, but, that's the way it is. But I'm kind of trying to implore you, when you do go down the dinghy road, don't sell yourself short, because a lot of shit is going to be involved with that dinghy. A lot of your attitude, a lot of your transportation is going to come and go. Things you're going to move back and forth. And if you have a really good dinghy, by the way, I'll just say this because I found this to be true, is that I spent less time on the dock when I upgraded my dinghy, because I can move stuff back and forth. I didn't need to go and say, oh, okay, I got to go to the dock because I need to pick up, 10 cases of beer or whatever the case may be, or all the groceries and all the rest of the stuff, or I have to pick up some, I actually redecked my boat, my entire boat, on the hook, because I couldn't do it in the marina, because the dust, and they didn't want me doing it there. So I went out on the hook, and the fact that I had a large enough dinghy to move materials back and forth between land and my boat saved me that, $75 to $100 per day in the dinghy, for the dock. So there's ways that if you have something nice, you could look at it, you can justify it in your mind that, okay, I could spend some money on a better dinghy because I'm going to save money on dockage. Yeah, consider that. So I've got this poor dinghy. The bow keeps going down, and I trade in my 15 horsepower, which, by the way, I had for around 10 years. And I liked it. I was very happy with it. But I kind of got this thing, like I saw other guys driving around with 40 horsepowers, and they were just zooming past me, and I was kind of, you know how that goes, guys. You know how that is. It's like, I need a little more horsepower in my life, and just need to look better. And so anyway, I bought the 40 horsepower, put the 40 horsepower on my Avon 15-footer, and it was like night and day. Boom! Boy, I had power, I had speed. The boat, it was amazing how well the boat ran, but I still had this problem with the bow. And I wanted to buy a new dinghy. Well, I was down in Nevis, and I was on my boat, and I had my Avon was always in the water on the outside with the 40 horsepower. And we had this big swell coming in. And if anybody has been to Nevis, to the Four Seasons there, they have this funky little dock that comes out where all the passengers and the guests come and go from. And it's not that high off the water, but when there's a good swell, the swell will come up underneath the dock and make it quite hazardous to keep the boat on the dock. They had a fishing charter boat, which had about 18, 20 people on, and local guy, and he had brought his boat up to the dock to get these people off his boat, and he had risen up on the swell and holed his hull into the dock, but just at the water line. And he had ripped a nice hole in it, and he was taking on water. And he had called me on the radio because I was at anchor, Perfectly okay. The swell was just rolling underneath me, no big deal. So I jumped in my dinghy. I went over and I took the passengers and I was taking the passengers off the boat and I was taking them back over to the dock. And then we were timing the rise up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And we finally got everybody off, and he was able to get a little. I have helped him get a little patch on it, on his hull, which we used some diapers, and which are great diapers and tampons, great for holes in boats because they take on the water, they swell, and they get pretty tight. And always good to have in case of an emergency. And they also suck up a lot of water, so they're good to have, they're good to have in your bilge to clean up oil and other stuff that might spill down there. So we kind of got him set. He was off back to St. Kitts where he kept his boat, and he was going to take it into the yard there right away and get it up. So the swell started to go down a little bit, and I went back to the dock. And when I came back to the dock, and I can't remember the reason I came back to the dock, but when I came back to the dock, just a huge swell caught me, drove the bow of my Avon, my old gray Avon with the slowly dissolving bow, underneath the dock, and it just filled with water and just popped it. And it was everything I could do in the last instance to get the gas tank out and to get the 40 horsepower. Literally, I took the 40 horsepower off the boat with one hand, lifted it up and put the engine up on the dock, and I hopped up on the dock, and the boat just swung underneath. The dinghy swung underneath the dock and just got crushed. I was without my dinghy, but I still had my motor. That's maybe one of the worst things that can happen to a dinghy, getting it caught up on a dock, getting it crushed against a pylon or something like that. They don't do well. A hard dinghy might have done a little bit better, but in that circumstance, I would have probably swamped it anyway. So it was a bad situation, trying to do good in a bad situation, and I just screwed it up. I didn't, I couldn't keep the boat away from the dock. That was the bottom line there. But I hopped, got back in my boat, got my engine back out, and I went to St. Martin. And luckily, I had enough money at the time to buy myself a nice Caribe. And the Caribe I bought was a little 3.5 meter Caribe. Now, this did not have a solid floor. It had the panels that go in the bottom of the floor, which is great. And it made for a really perfect kind of driving around. But I was really over horsepowered with the 40. And it was, I put that thing on there and it was a little bit crazy, but it was like so much fun. This thing was so fast, a little 3.5, 6, 7 feet and a 40 horsepower. I was flying. It was like super horsepower drag racing time. I could beat anybody, even a couple of the South African guys that had some pretty souped up dinghies. I could outrun them. I mean, this and nothing. But what happened was the hypalon that the dinghy is made of, that was perfect. That never had a problem with that. Even in sun, it was white sun, no problem. It stayed strong. But the floor, because it was these panels that you fit in the bottom of the floor, most of you have been around and know what I'm talking about. They began to crack. There's so much power in the floor that they began to crack. And in fact, I ended up fiberglassing them all to keep the dinghy, because I wanted to get a bigger dinghy. I just didn't at that time. I needed one more charter to get another dinghy. And I wanted to get a really good dinghy. I wanted to get another Caribe, which to me, and based on everything I knew, is exactly like the Novurania. So the whole flooring was like collapsing. So make sure future-wise you don't make the same mistake that I made, is that you got to match up the horsepower with the dinghy itself. Because if you have just a soft floor dinghy and you have a little motor on it, don't put something big on it. Just, nice and small, because that floor will collapse. It will break. It will, and it happened pretty fast. It happened like the third time I ran it. Any case, so that was my experience with that. I eventually did get a 15-foot Novurania, approximately 15 foot. I put that 40 horsepower on it, and it was just, I shouldn't say Novurania, but Caribe. And it was just wonderful to have, and I could go anywhere. I could beach it. I could go diving, which I did a lot of diving. Some later episodes I'm going to talk about some of the diving exploits. And it was just very utilitarian, very good looking, had no problem in towing it. So when you're setting up to tow your dinghy, one of the key things that you want to have is, first of all, in the dinghy itself, in the bow, there should be a nice eye that goes through the bow, through the fiberglass. You tow by that. That's the best way. I've seen people set up bridles where they tow from the top of the dinghy. That there's an attachment. There's D-rings that are glued onto the top. This is not going to serve you very well for very long. So it's better to tow it underneath the bow with a nice big eye bolt that goes through the dinghy and is fastened to the other side. And the reason is because when you do tow it, okay, it's going to lift the bow up, all right, and it's going to keep the bow up as you're going along, because there'll be a wake, and towing requires you to have some length in line. So when you're towing your boat, you want the dinghy to sit just on the top to the backside of the boat's wave. So in other words, the boat creates a wave, and behind it goes down, and then it rises up, and there's a wave that follows it. So you want your dinghy just to be on top of that wave, but just a little bit behind the apex of the wave, so that it stays in one position. Okay? So it doesn't get up and then just run down, and that line that you've put out there. And I would suggest using polypropylene because it floats, and you could use the different kinds of performance braid hybrids. Some of those will serve you very well, but I like the idea that poly floats, and the reason I like it is because I've had enough experience to know that getting a line caught in your prop is no fun at all, and it's very difficult to get out, and it's underwater, and it's usually the boat is going up and down to try to knock you out while you're under there trying to cut it out. With a serrated knife, by the way, I might add. A good serrated knife would be perfect. But anyway, poly is a good thing to do. So use the eye bolt. If there's not one there, put one in yourself to drag your dinghy along behind your back. Now, I've towed plenty of boats. I ran vessel assist in Marina del Rey for like 5 years. I towed every day for 5 years, all sorts of different kinds of boats. But one thing is if you tow, all right, make sure that line is attached on your boat to something as close to the center line of your boat as possible. And make sure it's as high up as possible. If it's a deck fitting, fine. Just make sure that deck fitting is pretty solid. And what you do is you have a hook. Now, how do you hook onto the boat? Usually, I always used a very, very heavy snap hook. That usually served me just fine. So I snap it on. I could take it off easily with one hand. Okay, but heavy duty, and then have the whole thing braided and really tied into the polyprop, really strong. And the other thing is when I have that hook, and then I would tie it off on one of my cleats, and then the cleat would run through, and sometimes I'd even put like leather up underneath it wherever I finally set it. I had these little pieces of leather that you could actually clip on. I found them in Turkey, I think, and you can actually clip on as to stop the abrasion on the line, because poly will the abrasion on poly, it'll eat through the line. So anyway, you're towing your boat. You want it to have as little resistance as possible. You want it to float, and you want it to keep kind of some momentum behind the boat. So when you start out, you just sort of feed the boat out. You feed the line out, let the boat get back, get it up on top of the wave, just near the back of the wave rather than the front, so it doesn't come down the wave and turn sideways, and you yanking it, and it's snapping the line and all the rest. And that way it'll settle in that line. Let out enough line. You may even want to go to the next wave, because there's one wave, there's two waves, there's waves behind you. You may even want to go to the next line if you're going for a really long distance, right? And that way that line can stay in the water a little bit. If you watch people tow, if you watch tugboats and stuff like that, oftentimes the line will go down into the water, okay? And it will come back up to the barge. And so you have this big sag in the line, and the barge, once it gets momentum and the tug gets the right speed, that line will stay in there. And then when you start to slow down and you're getting closer to where you're going to anchor or dockage or whatever, have your mate or yourself just start pulling in the line and get the dinghy tight up behind you, so that there's no extra line flopping around in the water to get into your prop, because that, my friend, is no fun. So once you have your dinghy, and also always remember, of course, to put your engine up so you're not dragging the prop through the water. And attaching the engine to the dinghy is pretty straightforward. But I often kind of always worried about it getting knocked off somehow. A wave or something, and didn't tighten up the toggles tight enough or something. I always had that kind of worry. So I did use a bolt from the engine through the back of the stern of the dinghy to make sure that the dinghy stayed there. But for the most time, if I was going on a really like a longer sail, I would always take the motor off and I'd put the motor up on the deck. And if I was just going from here to there, a couple hours sail or whatever the case may be, I just would leave it in the water. I went through a couple of hurricanes with just towing the dinghy like that. It was just no problem. But I didn't have anything in the dinghy at all. No gasoline tank, nothing. I had no motor, and I had it all up. So that's kind of how you organize. That's kind of how you organize all that. And I just want to call back to the idea that when you have a dinghy, it's your second boat. Take pride in it. It will engender pride in yourself. And it's really convenient to have something that moves along quite nicely. It's a lot of fun. It's really a lot of fun. And if you treat your dinghy right, and you buy something that's decent, I know that there's a lot of people that get like PVC type dinghies. That's great if you live in the northern climates. There's because the UV, but with climate change, I'm sure that PVC its life is numbered. Days of its life are numbered. So get the best you can buy. Invest in it. Figure out a way you could keep it up on your deck. If you're in the marina, try to keep it out of the water, because you'll need to put anti-foul paint on the dinghy itself, because a lot of these marinas will, there's a lot of growth. I always set up a nice little halyard system on my foredeck, and that way I could lift the dinghy up. I would lift the dinghy up, and usually in a dinghy, and the better dinghies with the hard bottom, there's rings, D-rings, or eye bolts that are in the bottom so that you could set up a nice little lift, and then sort of use a block and tackle and get it up on the boat and get it over. One of the things that in my dream of dreams, and I've had it before when I've run other people's boats, is my dream of dreams is to have a dinghy garage. I would live in the dinghy garage, to be honest. I love dinghy garages. Just to bring the dinghy up, put it underneath, have the platform come up, close the back of the stern of the boat up, and the dinghy is in there. It's done. You don't have to tow it. You don't have to lift it. You don't have to do anything to it. And it's just in the garage. That part I love. That's my dream. So I'm never going to buy another boat without a dinghy garage. I don't care about the room in the rest of the boat. I just want a nice place for a nice dinghy. Because, to be honest, folks, once you have a nice dinghy, you're going to spend a lot of time using it. Okay? You're going to be out in an anchorage. The first thing you're going to do is hop in the dinghy and go someplace. You're going to go into that bar. And you're going to need to go into that bar. You're going to have to go through some surf possibly. Okay? You're going to have to go up to a dock. You're going to have yourself a little dinghy anchor, right? So you could put that dinghy out there. All right? And then bring a line into the sand on the beach, so the thing can sit out there at anchor all by itself just beyond the surf, and then you can take the line in. You can just pull the line in and pull the boat in and jump in, and guys can take off through the surf, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of technique involved. If you have a place that's that you're going to be going that has coral in the shallow parts and stuff where you're going to have to walk your dinghy through. Always recommend having yourself a good pair of sandals that can take the water and walk in the water with, or some dive shoes, that have a bottom to them that you can walk over the water, over the coral. These little things you learn as you go on. Another thing is if you're going to be wearing pants, make sure they can dry pretty fast on their own. That's a biggie. There's nothing like sitting in a bar drinking with wet shorts. Just terrible. So anyway, that's just my little take on dinghies. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion. Go ahead and just send me the messages, folks. We can get into it. Dinghies are a very personal kind of thing, and I'm sure there's a lot of advice out there on various different things about what the best thing to do is. But quite honestly, get a nice hard bottom dinghy. If you can find a Caribe, it's less expensive than a Novurania, but if I could afford a Novurania, I would get a Novurania. Ideally, I love a Novurania Como 18. Best. It has a center console, which is a little big for most boats. But you can have the console taken out, and you can have like a smaller version of that kind of Novurania Como. And but Caribe has some of the same stuff. They have more practical stuff. You can get a nice solid dinghy that's going to last you for years if you don't get it caught up underneath docks or catch a nail on a dock when you go in to run into happy hour or whatever the case may be. And only one little thing that I will add to dinghies and dinghy docks. A lot of damn thieves out there. And I always had a chain that I would use. The chain, it would be around the motor. The chain would be around the motor with the lock. And of course, you have your safety switch thingamabob. And I would use that, and I'd run the wire, actually. I'd run the coated wire up around the dinghy, and then I would hook it onto someplace on the dock that I could lock so that somebody wouldn't jump in my dinghy and take off. And I have been guilty of getting in the wrong dinghy and trying to leave. Yes. Because it looked exactly like mine, and I couldn't figure out why the lock didn't work. But in any case, there's a whole setup you can do with that, and that's kind of a cool setup to keep it. But the other thing is and I want to talk about the safety switch. You know, the little red thing with the little clip, the safety clip that goes in to kill the motor, whatever. Whatever you do, folks, please, 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 always have that thing plugged in and have it on your wrist. We had a very tragic incident once. We were all having a party on a boat, and this young woman, she had come over with, in fact, a brand new Novurania center console, very powerful, and it had twin 115s on it, probably 22 feet. It was a tender for a larger yacht, but she was invited to this party with a bunch of us old scallywags. And she'd had a couple of drinks. Thanks, it was very nice. She went in, started the motor, right? And she didn't have a lot of experience with this boat. She put it into gear, all right, and not realizing how powerful this thing was, that she only had to just touch it. Pushed it, it went off. She fell out of the boat, and the dinghy took off, 115 horsepower, full on, all right? And it started to go around, and it went around in a circle, came up. She came up from under the water, up, and her face took the prop, and it cut her face right across, high cheekbone, almost lost her eye, all the way down, almost lost her complete jaw, that part of her jaw. Her bone was actually sliced. It was a terrible situation. Beautiful girl. And it took everything that we could do to get that dinghy away from the boat and away from her, and to get her into our boat and render her first aid. And she was bleeding so much. It was such a terrible incident, so much blood. We were actually worried about sharks. We got her into a dinghy. We raced her to the hospital. This was in St. Thomas. She got care. And eventually had a lot of plastic surgery. And if she had had that safety clip around her wrist and in the boat, when she fell back, that would have killed the switch, killed the boat, and the boat wouldn't have gone anywhere. It would have floated off. The engine would have been turned off. We could have gone after the bit, brought it back, got her in the boat, and it would have been just a humiliating kind of sailing experience, which you get over, because if you haven't been sailing, you haven't been humiliated. And if you haven't been humiliated, go sailing. And she would have been safe. But because she didn't have the kill switch, she has a scar that runs basically from almost the top of her head all the way around to underneath her jaw. I saw her a few years later. Her name is Mindy. And she's from South Africa, and she is, you would never see the scar. She's had some brilliant facial reconstruction. She's just fantastic. She's very lucky at that, but she lost a bunch of teeth. The blade literally went through her cheek, through her teeth, and split her jawbone. So whatever you do, folks, have the kill switch plugged in, have it around your wrist. Good practice, always. So that's my thing on dinghies. I could talk about dinghies forever and ever and ever. But if you have some questions, get in contact, leave a message. I'll be happy to answer them. If you get some criticisms, I'll listen to them. And we'll go from there. All right. Thank you.
That was kind of scary, the whole thing of the girl getting hit by the prop. I mean, you know, how often does something like that happen?
Well, it happens more than you would think. A lot of people do not use that lanyard And I know I am completely guilty of not doing that sometimes. And but she was in a boat that was she wasn't used to. It was very powerful, and literally this boat could stand up and do a wheelie almost. That's how powerful it was. And I know I only, for the sake of graphic politeness, I only talk about the blade coming around and cutting her face once. The boat actually hit her twice, and a friend of mine actually leaped into the water and hit the boat so it would change course, and he almost lost his leg. We eventually corralled the dinghy after it ran out of fuel, and it was a horrific night. We got her to the hospital right away, and then she was airvac'd from there to from St. Thomas to Miami, where they operated on her face, and it's an incredibly sad affair. But it is something that's happened. I mean, I've seen people with little 15 horsepower motors standing up. And, like sometimes they put a pole on the throttle, a tube on the throttle so they can move forward to get the dinghy up and planing. And it's too far for the lanyard to reach. And boom, you see them fly off or hit something. It's crazy. Dinghies can be very dangerous, but having a good dinghy is a really important part of sailing. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and listening to the episode, it seems like it's quite a bone of contention, or at least it's a very important. People have a lot of strong opinions about dinghies and their favorite dinghy, and I'm sure that people will have a comment about which motors they prefer and which dinghies they prefer. And as always, you can go to Offshore Explorer's Facebook page. We have a pretty active community there if you want to chime in and tell us about what dinghy you use for your boat, and what motor you use and what's your favorite. Because it seems to me like it's almost like sporting teams. Everybody's got their favorite one.
Well,
right?
I think it's a little bit, not to contest with you, but I think it's a little bit more than that. I mean, there's a lot of cheap shit out there, to be honest. And Honda and Yamaha are the two premier brands. And you can talk to anybody who uses dinghies a lot, professional people, and they will tell you that those are the two choices. And of course, my dream is always the Novurania. That's the creme de la creme. And my point, I guess, is just to tell everybody, don't get cheap on a dinghy. Just get what's needed. Get a strong, utilitarian, strength-wise dinghy.
Yeah, and of course, if you might be dependent upon it to save your life. If you get stranded out in the middle of the ocean, you don't want to cheap out on your life. And on a less sober note, what do we have planned for next week?
We're actually planning to have a guest interview. We're putting that together, and we'll have more information about midweek, and I'll give an alert as to that. But I think I have two guests lined up, hopefully, both of which travel a lot, so we're trying to squeeze in some time. But it should be really interesting conversation.
Thank you for tuning in. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to rate and review. You can find us on Facebook and at offshoreexplorer.org. Our theme song is sung by Paulette McWilliams, with additional music by Manu Itomi and Tommy Twing.
Until next time, fair winds and calm seas.